Richard Hayes stood in his living room on Christmas Eve, staring at a tree he'd decorated alone for the 23rd year in a row. The ornaments hung in the same positions they always did. A careful reconstruction of the last Christmas his daughter Melissa had been home. The clay star she'd made in second grade, her handprint pressed into the center and painted gold, hung on the third branch from the top on the left side. The photo ornament from her high school graduation dangled near the middle. The little ceramic angel she'd bought at a craft fair when she was 14 still claimed its spot near the tree's heart. Richard knew where each one belonged because he'd been preserving this exact arrangement since she disappeared. Like if he kept everything exactly the same, she might somehow find her way back to this moment. He was 68 now, and he felt every single year tonight. His wife Catherine had died 5 years ago, her heart finally giving out under the weight of grief that neither of them had ever learned to carry properly. The doctors called it a heart attack, but Richard knew better. You can only spend so many years hoping and breaking and hoping again before something vital inside you just stops working. She'd made him promise, 3 days before the end, that he wouldn't give up looking for Melissa, that he'd keep the tree up every Christmas, keep the bedroom exactly as it was, keep believing that somewhere out there their daughter was alive. He'd kept that promise, even though keeping it had turned him into a ghost haunting his own life. 23 years. Melissa had been 19 when she vanished, driving home from visiting a college friend 2 states over. December 18th, a Tuesday, light snow forecasted but nothing severe. She'd called from a rest stop around 3 in the afternoon, told Catherine she's the 500th be home by dinner, said she loved them and would see them soon. Those were the last words they ever heard from her. Her car was found the next morning on the shoulder of Highway 40, driver's door open, keys in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with her wallet and phone still inside. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no trace of Melissa. Just a blue Honda Civic sitting empty on a cold stretch of highway, and 2 parents whose lives stopped making sense that day. Richard had done everything. Filed police reports, hired private investigators, plastered her face on flyers in every town within 300 miles, created social media pages, appeared on local news segments, followed up on every lead, every possible sighting, every phone call from someone who thought maybe they'd seen her. 13 times over the years, he'd gotten his hopes up about women who resembled Melissa. 13 times, those hopes had crashed into nothing. DNA tests that didn't match, wrong eye color upon closer inspection, cases of mistaken identity that left him more broken than before. The house still smelled like the cinnamon cookies he'd baked that morning, another tradition he couldn't bring himself to abandon. Melissa had loved those cookies. Every Christmas Eve, they'd bake them together while Catherine wrapped last-minute presents and complained that they were eating more dough than they were actually baking. Richard had made them alone this morning, the kitchen too quiet, the recipe cards still stained with flour from Melissa's 19-year-old hands. He checked his watch. 7:15. The small diner on Main Street would still be open, probably empty on Christmas Eve except for Joe, the owner, and maybe 1 or 2 other people with nowhere else to be. Richard grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, the same heavy wool one he'd worn for 15 years, and stepped out into the snow. It was falling softly, the kind of gentle snowfall that made the world feel muffled and distant. Christmas lights glowed from neighboring houses, and he could hear carols drifting from the direction of St. Mary's Church down the block. Normal people were inside with their families, warm and whole and unbroken. Richard walked alone down the sidewalk, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, heading toward the one place that still felt connected to his daughter. The Riverside Diner had been Melissa's favorite spot. Every Christmas Eve, from the time she was 7 until she turned 18, they'd walk there together after decorating the tree, just the 2 of them, and order hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. They'd sit in the corner booth, and she'd tell him about school, about her dreams, about the boy she liked, or the teacher who didn't understand her, or the book she was reading that was changing how she saw the world. Richard had kept that tradition alive even after she disappeared, walking to the diner alone every Christmas Eve, ordering 2 hot chocolates, drinking one and leaving the other untouched across from him. Joe had stopped charging him for the second cup years ago. The diner's neon sign glowed red and green in the snowy darkness. Richard pushed through the door, a small bell chiming above his head, and started to unbutton his coat. Then he looked up and his entire world stopped. Behind the counter, pouring coffee for the only other customer in the place, was a woman who looked exactly like Melissa would look now. Not similar, not kind of like her. Exactly like her. Exactly like her, same height, Same build, same way of standing with her weight shifted slightly to her left side. Same green eyes that had always reminded Richard of sea glass. Same dark hair, though it was longer now, pulled back in a ponytail. And when she turned her head to grab a napkin from the dispenser, Richard saw it. The small scar above her left eyebrow, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. A thin white line that had been there since she was 7 years old. The cup of coffee he'd been holding slipped from his hand and shattered against the floor. The waitress looked up, startled, and immediately came around the counter. "Oh my goodness, are you okay? Here, let me help you with that." Her voice was concerned, kind, and Richard couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stare at her face, at the features he'd memorized from thousands of photographs, at the daughter he'd been searching for since she was 19 years old. She knelt down to pick up the larger pieces of broken ceramic, and Richard saw her name tag. Emma, not Melissa. Emma. "Sir, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Should I call someone?" She stood up, disposing of the broken cup, studying his face with genuine worry. Richard's throat felt like it had been filled with concrete. He tried to speak, but nothing came out at first. Finally, forcing the words past the shock, he managed to ask, "Have you ever been to Riverside before? Did you grow up here?" Emma's expression changed. Something flickered across her face, confusion mixed with something Richard couldn't quite identify. She glanced at Joe, who was watching from behind the register, then back at Richard. "I don't think so. I mean, I don't really remember much from before I was 19. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Richard's feet. "What do you mean you don't remember?" Emma hesitated, clearly unsure why this stranger was asking such personal questions, but something in Richard's face must have convinced her to answer. "I woke up in a hospital in Pennsylvania 23 years ago. Car accident," they said. "I had retrograde amnesia. No ID, no memory of who I was or where I came from. No one ever reported me missing in that area. I've been Emma for 23 years because I don't remember who I was before." Richard's hands started shaking so badly he had to grip the counter to stay upright. 23 years ago. Pennsylvania, which was 2 states over, right along the route Melissa had been taking. December, right around when his daughter vanished. He fumbled for his wallet, his fingers clumsy and desperate, and pulled out the photograph he'd carried every single day since Melissa disappeared. It was her senior portrait, the last professional photo they'd had taken. She was smiling, 18 years old, whole and real and alive. He held it out to Emma with trembling hands. "Does this look familiar? Does she look like anyone you might know?" Emma took the photograph carefully, and Richard watched her face as she studied it. He saw the exact moment she registered the resemblance. Her eyes widened, her hand came up to her mouth. She looked from the photo to Richard and back again, and her face had gone completely pale. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Who is this?" "My daughter." Richard's voice broke on the word. "Her name is Melissa Hayes. She disappeared 23 years ago on December 18th. She was driving home from visiting a friend. We found her car abandoned on Highway 40, but we never found her. She just vanished." Emma sank into the nearest chair, still holding the photograph, her hands shaking now too. "I woke up on December 20th. The hospital said someone found me unconscious on a rural road about 15 miles from Highway 40. Head trauma, no ID. They ran my prints, but nothing came up. Put my photo in the local papers, but no one claimed me." Richard sat down across from her, his legs no longer capable of holding him up. Joe had stopped even pretending not to listen. The other customer had left at some point. It was just the 3 of them in the diner now, the world outside continuing on, while time seemed to have stopped completely inside. "The scar above your eyebrow," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get it?" Emma's hand rose instinctively to touch the small white line. "I don't know. I've had it as long as I can remember, but that's not very long. Why?" Richard closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, tears were streaming down his face. "Melissa fell off her bike when she was 7 years old, right outside our house. She hit the pavement face first and split her eyebrow open. Catherine and the first rushed her to the emergency room. She needed 6 stitches. She hated that scar when she was younger, but Catherine always told her it made her unique, that it was part of her story." Emma's hand was still touching her eyebrow, her eyes wide and filling with tears. The photograph of young Melissa lay on the table between them, and the resemblance was impossible to deny. Same face, just aged 23 years. Same scar in exactly the same place. "I need to know," Richard said, and his voice was desperate now. raw with 23 years of hope and heartbreak. I need to know if you're her. Would you be willing to take a DNA test? Emma looked at him for a long moment, and Richard saw his own desperate hope reflected in her eyes. She'd spent 23 years not knowing who she was, and he'd spent 23 years searching for his daughter. Maybe, impossibly, they'd both been searching for the same answer. If this story is pulling at your heart, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will change everything these two people thought they knew about fate and family. Yes, Emma whispered. Yes, I'll take the test. I've spent my entire adult life wondering who I was before the accident. If there's even a chance that I'm your daughter, that I'm Melissa, I need to know. Richard pulled out his phone with shaking hands and found the name of the private investigator he'd worked with for years. It was Christmas Eve, nearly 8 o'clock at night, but he didn't care. He made the call. Explained the situation. The investigator, a woman named Sarah, who'd become almost like family over the years, didn't hesitate. She'd have a DNA testing kit couriered to the diner within the hour and rush the results. While they waited, Richard and Emma sat across from each other in that corner booth, the same booth where Richard had sat with Melissa every Christmas Eve of her childhood. He told her about his daughter, about how she'd wanted to be a nurse, about her terrible singing voice that she'd inflict on anyone unfortunate enough to be in the car with her, about the way she decorated her room with fairy lights and posters of bands she thought were deeper than they actually were, about how much Catherine had loved her, how they'd been best friends as much as mother and daughter. Emma listened to every word, searching her blank memory for any flicker of recognition, any echo of the life Richard was describing. Nothing came, just the same empty space that had existed in her mind for 23 years. But something else was happening. With each story Richard told, each detail he shared, Emma felt something settling into place. Not memory, but maybe something more important, the possibility of belonging. The answer to a question she'd been asking her entire adult life. The DNA kit arrived at 8:45. They did the swabs right there in the diner, Joe serving as witness. Richard held the sealed samples like they contained the entire future, which maybe they did. Sarah promised results in 72 hours, calling in every favor she had to rush the lab work. Richard drove home through snow that was falling heavier now, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Emma's phone number was saved in his contacts. The photograph of young Melissa sat on his passenger seat where Emma had handed it back, along with a photo Emma had given him in return, a recent one from her driver's license. He'd stared at it for 5 full minutes in the diner parking lot, seeing his daughter's face aged by time and trauma and a life lived without him. He couldn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after that. He pulled boxes down from the attic, Melissa's things that Catherine had carefully packed and preserved. He read letters she'd written home from summer camp when she was 12, looked through photo albums documenting every stage of her life from birth to 19, remembered the daughter he'd lost, and tried to prepare himself for the possibility that maybe, impossibly, miraculously, she'd been found. 3 days felt like 3 years. Richard barely ate, barely slept, spending most of his time sitting by his computer waiting for the email that would either answer 23 years of questions or crush what might be his last real hope. Emma called him twice during those 72 hours, once just to hear his voice, once to ask if he really thought it was possible. Richard didn't know how to answer that. He'd learned the hard way that hope was a dangerous thing to hold too tightly. The email arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon on December 27th. Richard was sitting at his kitchen table, the same table where Melissa had done her homework, where Catherine had served thousands of family dinners, where he'd eaten alone for 5 years now. His phone rang at the same moment the email notification appeared. Emma. They'd agreed to open the results together, even if they were in different places. Richard's hands shook so badly he could barely click the email open. He put Emma on speaker, and he could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, quick and shallow like she'd been running. "I'm opening it now," Richard said, his voice barely steady. The email from Sarah was brief, just 2 lines before the attachment. "Richard, I rushed this as fast as humanly possible. The results are conclusive. Call me after you've read them." Richard clicked on the PDF attachment and the screen filled with technical language, genetic markers, probability percentages, all the scientific terminology that separated hope from truth. His eyes scanned down to the bottom, to the section marked Conclusion, and the words there made the entire world stop spinning. Based on the genetic markers analyzed, the probability of paternity between Richard Hayes and the individual identified as Emma Whitfield is 99.9%. Richard Hayes is conclusively the biological father of Emma Whitfield. The phone slipped from Richard's hand and clattered against the table. He heard Emma's voice, tinny and distant, saying his name, asking if he was there, asking what the results said, but he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stare at those words that he'd been praying to see for 23 years. Emma was Melissa, the waitress he'd met on Christmas Eve. The woman with no memory of her first 19 years was his daughter. She was alive. She'd been alive this entire time, living a different life, under a different name, and now she was found. Richard picked up the phone with trembling hands and tried to speak, but what came out was a sob. 23 years of grief and searching and refusing to give up came pouring out of him in a sound he didn't recognize as his own voice. "Dad?" Emma's voice was soft, uncertain, testing out the word like she wasn't sure she had the right to use it. "Is it true? Am I really Melissa?" "Yes." Richard managed to get the word out between sobs. "Yes, you're my daughter. You're Melissa. You're my little girl, and I found you. I finally found you." On the other end of the line, Emma broke down crying too. Not the quiet tears of someone trying to hold it together, but the kind of crying that came from 23 years of not knowing who you were, where you came from, whether anyone had ever loved you. Now she knew. She had a father who'd never stopped looking. A mother who'd loved her until her last breath. A whole life that had been waiting for her to come back to it. They stayed on the phone for an hour, both of them crying, both of them trying to process what felt too big to be real. Finally, Richard asked if she'd come to the house. If she'd come home. Emma said yes before he'd even finished the question. She arrived 2 hours later, parking her old Toyota in the driveway of a house she didn't remember, but that remembered her in every detail. Richard opened the door before she'd even reached the porch, and they stood there looking at each other for a long moment. Father and daughter, separated by 23 years and a missing piece of life that might never be recovered. Then Emma stepped forward and Richard pulled her into his arms, holding his daughter for the first time since she was 19 years old, and the world finally made sense again. Richard gave her a tour of the house, narrating each room like a museum guide describing precious artifacts. The kitchen where Catherine had taught her to bake. The living room where they'd watch movies every Friday night. The backyard where she'd learned to ride that bike, the one she'd eventually fall off and earn her scar. Emma walked through it all in a daze, touching things carefully, searching for any spark of recognition. A few times she paused, her hand on a doorframe or resting on the back of a chair, and something would flicker across her face. Not quite memory, but maybe the ghost of one, an echo of familiarity she couldn't quite grasp. Her bedroom stopped her completely. Richard had left it exactly as it had been the day she disappeared. The same fairy lights strung around the ceiling. The same posters on the walls, bands from the early 2000s that had probably seemed profound to a 19-year-old. The same books on the shelves, spines cracked from repeated reading. The same stuffed rabbit on the bed, worn threadbare from years of childhood love. Emma picked up the rabbit slowly, turning it over in her hands. "Mr. Carrots," she whispered, and Richard's heart nearly stopped. "What did you say?" Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide and confused. "I don't know. That name just came to me, Mr. Carrots. Is that what I called him?" Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "You named him when you were 3 years old. You took him everywhere until you were 12 and decided you were too old for stuffed animals. But you never got rid of him. Catherine always said you'd want him back someday." Emma held the rabbit against her chest, and tears started falling again. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was just the overwhelming weight of finding pieces of yourself you didn't know were missing. Either way, she stood in that childhood bedroom holding Mr. C. Carrots, and crying, and Richard stood in the doorway giving her space to feel whatever she needed to feel. When she'd composed herself, they went back downstairs and sat in the living room, the Christmas tree still standing in its usual corner, lights twinkling against the evening darkness. Emma had brought a photo album of her own, 23 years of life as Emma Whitfield, and she opened it now with trembling hands. "I want you to know who I became," she said quietly. "Even if I wasn't Melissa, I was someone. I built a life. Maybe you should know what that life looked like." Richard moved closer, and together they went through Emma's album. Pictures of her graduating from nursing school, wearing scrubs with a shy smile. Richard's breath caught. "You became a nurse," he said. "You wanted to be a nurse. Before you disappeared, you were studying to be a nurse." Emma stared at him. "I didn't know that. When I woke up in the hospital with no memory, I just knew I wanted to help people. The nurses who took care of me were so kind, and I thought maybe that's what I should do. I didn't know it was something I'd already chosen. They continued through the photos. Emma's small apartment, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable. Emma at the diner where she'd worked for the past 15 years, Joe's arm around her shoulders in a fatherly way. Emma volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends. Emma alone at Christmas, a small tree in the corner of her apartment, no family to celebrate with because she'd never had any family at all. Until now. Richard showed her his own albums then, filling in the 19 years of her life that the amnesia had stolen. Baby pictures, first day of school photos, birthday parties and holidays, and ordinary moments that had made up a childhood. Emma studied each photo like she was memorizing faces and places she should have remembered but couldn't. She asked questions about everything. What was her favorite color? Purple. What did she want to be when she grew up? It changed every week, but nurse had been the final answer. Did she have friends? Yes, a best friend named Kara who'd moved to California and gotten married and had 3 kids, and still sent Christmas cards every year asking if there was any news about Melissa. What happened? Emma asked finally, the question that had been hovering between them since the DNA results came back. Why can't I remember any of this? What happened to me on that highway? Richard took a deep breath and shared everything the investigators had pieced together over the years. Melissa had left her friend's house around 2 in the afternoon on December 18th. Security footage from a rest stop showed her getting gas around 3:15. After that, nothing until her car was found the next morning. The weather had been fine, no reason for an accident. The car had no damage, no signs of mechanical failure. It was just abandoned on the shoulder of Highway 40, driver's door open, everything inside untouched except Melissa herself. The investigators had theorized for years about what might have happened. Maybe she'd stopped to help someone and been taken. Maybe she'd seen something she shouldn't have. Maybe she'd had some kind of medical emergency. But with no witnesses and no Melissa to ask, it had remained a mystery that haunted Richard and Catherine for over 2 decades. Emma filled in what she knew from the other side. She'd been found on December 20th, unconscious on a rural road about 15 miles from where her car had been abandoned. A farmer on his way home had seen her lying in the snow and called for help. The doctor said she'd suffered severe head trauma, the kind that could cause retrograde amnesia. They'd kept her in the hospital for 2 weeks, waiting for someone to claim her, waiting for her memory to return. Neither thing happened. When she was medically cleared, she was released with no name, no history, no past. A social worker helped her get temporary identification under the name Emma Whitfield. She'd been building a life from nothing ever since. 2 days, Richard said quietly. You were missing for 2 days between when your car was found and when you were discovered. Anything could have happened in that time. An accident we never found evidence of. Someone who hurt you and left you for dead. We might never know the full truth. Emma nodded slowly, processing. Does it matter? I mean, I know it matters, but does it change anything about right now? I might never remember those 2 days. I might never remember the first 19 years of my life. Does that change the fact that I'm your daughter? Richard looked at this woman, who was and wasn't Melissa, who carried his genes in his daughter's face, but lived in a stranger's memories. No, he said firmly. No, it doesn't change anything. You're my daughter. Memory or no memory, you're Melissa. And I've been looking for you for 23 years, and now you're home. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of catching up, of Richard introducing Emma to neighbors who remembered Melissa, of phone calls to the handful of family members still alive who wept at the news. Sarah, the private investigator, closed her file with tears in her eyes, telling Richard this was the case she'd never thought would actually get solved. Kara flew in from California and spent 3 hours showing Emma photos and telling stories, hoping something might spark a memory. Nothing did, but Emma listened to every word, slowly learning who she'd been. On New Year's Eve, Richard and Emma sat together in front of the Christmas tree that Richard still hadn't taken down. Emma had brought Chinese takeout, and they ate straight from the containers like Richard used to do with Melissa when Catherine was out of town, and they were too lazy to cook properly. I need to tell you about your mother, Richard said as midnight approached, about Catherine. He told Emma everything. How Catherine and Melissa had been more like best friends than mother and daughter. How Catherine had never given up hope, even when the investigators said the chances of finding Melissa alive decreased with every passing year. How she'd made Richard promise to keep looking, to keep the house exactly as it was, to never stop believing. How her heart had literally broken under the weight of not knowing, of hoping and grieving simultaneously for over 18 years. She would have given anything to see you one more time, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. She died believing you were still out there somewhere. And she was right. She was always right. Emma wiped tears from her eyes. I wish I could have met her. I wish I could remember her. You did meet her, Richard said gently. You just don't remember. But she loved you more than anything in this world, and wherever she is now, she knows we found each other. I have to believe that. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Richard stood and walked to the Christmas tree. He reached for the clay star ornament, the one with Melissa's tiny handprint pressed into the gold paint, the one he'd hung in the exact same spot for 23 years. He took it down carefully and handed it to Emma. This was always yours, he said. You made it in second grade, Mrs. Ockengrade, Patterson's art class. You were so proud of it that you insisted we put it on the tree that very night, even though Christmas was still 3 weeks away. And it always will be yours. Emma took the ornament with trembling hands, tracing the small handprint with her finger. It was tiny, a child's hand, the hand of a 7-year-old Melissa, who'd lived and laughed and played and had no idea that 12 years later her entire life would be erased. Emma held that piece of her lost childhood, and something inside her shifted. Not memory exactly, but something deeper. A sense of belonging, a feeling of home. Outside, fireworks started going off as midnight arrived. Neighbors were cheering, celebrating the new year. Inside Richard's living room, father and daughter sat together in the glow of Christmas lights, not celebrating what was coming, but what had finally, impossibly, miraculously arrived. Richard had spent 23 years searching for his daughter, following every lead, refusing to give up even when everyone told him hope was foolish. Emma had spent 23 years searching for herself, for the identity stolen by trauma and amnesia, for the life she couldn't remember but somehow knew she'd lost. On Christmas Eve, in a small diner on a snowy street, their searches had ended not because they'd planned it, but because the universe had decided it was finally time. Emma might never remember being Melissa. The doctors said retrograde amnesia, this severe, rarely reversed itself. She might never recall the first 19 years of her life, never remember her mother's face or her childhood home or the thousands of small moments that had made her who she'd been. But she didn't need to remember to know the truth. Family wasn't just about shared memory. It was about shared DNA, shared love, shared commitment to never giving up on each other, even when all logic said you should. Richard wasn't alone anymore. Emma knew who she was, where she came from, that she'd been loved desperately and searched for relentlessly. And as snow continued to fall outside and the new year began, they sat together exactly where they were supposed to be. Two pieces of a broken family finally made whole again. Proof that sometimes the greatest miracles happen, not because we deserve them, but because we refuse to stop believing they're possible. The clay star with the tiny handprint sat on Emma's lap, and when Richard looked at his daughter, he saw both the child she'd been and the woman she'd become. Different names, different memories, same heart. His Melissa had come home at last.